Good morning and welcome to another Sunday session with HGP, the Humanists of Greater Portland. My name is Anand Atre, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be your MC for today's event, which is being recorded. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech, but the views expressed by myself, our reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. For those who are new to humanism or HGP, humanism represents a progressive way of thinking. It is informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. A humanistic approach to life is grounded in reason and our shared humanity, making a humanistic lifestyle one that aligns with social and planetary responsibility. Humanistic values are not based on appeals to external deities. Instead, they are formed when humans use reason and reflect with empathy on our experiences, collective needs, and capacity for flourishing. Paramount among these values is the commitment to uphold the dignity of all human beings. Without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to our reader for this week, who is our peerless president, Ann Henderson.
I am peerless. I am not fearless, but I am peerless. And thinking about fearlessness, I'll give you this reading. You want to understand why America is like this, why Trump happened, why the rot keeps spreading, why cruelty isn't a bug, but a feature? It's not a mystery. It's the oldest story we've never told honestly. And until we face it, we will keep collapsing into darker versions of ourselves. This country was not founded on freedom. It was founded on stolen land, cleared by slaughter, and built by stolen people, broken by force. That is the foundational transaction. Everything else is decoration. We did not recognize with the genocide of Native peoples. We mythologized it. We made Westerns about it. We named football teams after the dead. We paved over bones and called it destiny. We did not reckon with slavery. We declared it over and then immediately wrote new laws to replace chains with prison bars. We never paid for the centuries of free labor, for the children sold, for the torture, for the theft of time and breath and lineage. We made a new America, but left the engine intact. The Confederacy lost the war, but won the memory. We let them rewrite history in marble. The monuments didn't go up in 1865. They went up in the 1950s, not as remembrance, but as a warning. We never cleansed the institutions. The racists became sheriffs. The sheriffs became senators. And the logic of white supremacy adapted, changed shape, changing code, but never losing its grip. That's why America elects racists, not in spite of our history, but because of it. When the mask slips and the candidate says the quiet part out loud, it doesn't alienate the country. It clarifies it. Trump didn't invent any of this. He just said it without shame. And for millions, that was the fantasy, a man who would take every buried cruelty and wear it like a crown. This is why they're banning books, why they're rewriting curricula, why the very mention of racism or history now sets off alarms. Because they know what we'd find if we looked too closely. A country terrified of its own reflection. Reparations aren't radical, they're overdue. Truth-telling isn't divisive. It's the only way out. And if we don't learn from Germany, if we don't enshrine what happened, criminalize its symbols, and build laws that make it unrepeatable, then we are telling the future exactly what we're willing to tolerate again. America doesn't confront its breaking points. It buries them. Call it pride, wraps it in an anthem and the flag, but buried things don't disappear. They grow back meaner, and we are running out of time to break the cycle. Lyle Bass wrote this. I'm not sure who he is.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that poignant, somber, yet very profound reading. I think it's touched a lot of people over here. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker who is joining us over Zoom. She is the executive director of Path Home, a nonprofit that empowers families with children to get back into housing and stay there. For more than 20 years, she has provided direct services to thousands of families with children experiencing homelessness in Oregon. She currently serves on the American Leadership Forum of Oregon's board and the national board of the American Leadership Forum, as well as the Multnomah County Continuum of Care Board. She has been honored with the prestigious 2023 CNN Hero Award and received the 40 Under 40 Award from the Portland Business Journal, as well as Portland Monthly's Light a Fire Award for Extraordinary Executive Director. Her presentation today, titled Solution Salon, will examine the root causes of homelessness and provide us with insights into what can be done to end the crisis. So please join me in giving a big HGP welcome to Brandi Tuck.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for being interested in learning about homelessness. Today, we are going to talk about the history of homelessness and talk about who experiences homelessness, learn about some of our community's unique challenges regarding homelessness, and then look at proven solutions that work. I want to quickly introduce myself and Path Home. As was said, I am Brandi Tuck, and for the last 18 years, I have been the executive director of Path Home. Our mission is to empower homeless families with children to get back into housing and stay there. Our roots go back 30 years to 1994, when we opened the Goose Hollow Family Shelter, which was the first shelter for homeless families with children in Portland. Today, we operate Family Village Shelter, which is the first shelter in Oregon featuring trauma-informed design and architecture. We also help families move from homelessness to housing, and we prevent homelessness for families who are facing eviction. Each year, we serve over 600 families, which is about 1,500 kids and parents. We are one of the only organizations in Multnomah County that exclusively serves kids and parents who are experiencing homelessness. And so as we go through the presentation today, I'm going to be speaking to you a lot about the perspective of kids and families who don't have homes. So let's dive in. Let's talk quickly about the history of homelessness. Our country has had homelessness since the very beginning, going back to the colonial days when the United States was first forming. We came over and stole indigenous land, and we had no white people infrastructure. And so right away we had homelessness in America. And that persisted all the way through colonial America, up through the Civil War, into the Industrial Revolution. Maybe you've read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and have heard about the awful, horrible poverty conditions that existed in our country. And homelessness has basically been rampant in America the whole time we've been a country, except between 1940 and 1980. When we had a 40-year period after the Great Depression and World War II, where homelessness basically went away. And it went away because the US government was investing in creating and maintaining safe, affordable public housing where folks could live. They were investing $80 billion a year in the Federal Housing Administration. And using that funding, we built a national infrastructure of housing between the 40s and the 80s that housed everyone who was living on low or no incomes. And then in the late 70s and the early 80s, our country's public housing system was defunded and dismantled, going from a funding level of $80 billion a year down to $20 billion a year. And the result was that we stopped building new affordable housing. And the housing stock we did have fell into really bad disrepair. So we tore it all down, and then we never rebuilt it. And this has left us with a national shortage of housing that's affordable to people at lower income levels. And now this doesn't mean that we have a total shortage of housing. There are actually thousands of available apartments in Portland, Oregon today. They're just not affordable to people with no or low income. And we're going to come back to this in a little while. So after our country disinvested in and dismantled our national infrastructure of housing in the 80s and 90s, we saw a huge increase in homelessness around the country. And this was certainly our experience here in Portland as visible homelessness started showing up on our streets in the late 80s and the early 90s. And we've seen homelessness in Portland ever since. In 2015, things felt so extreme that the city of Portland announced the first homelessness state of emergency. That was 10 years ago. And since then, it feels like things have only gotten worse. We can look around our community and our city and see just a huge number of people living on the streets. And it feels like it has come to a crisis over the last few years, as there are way more people experiencing homelessness now than even there were in 2015 when the state of emergency was created. And so this is what the public, we all look around and we see this crisis, that there are too many people camping on our streets. And that's true. And it's way more nuanced than that. There are many different kinds of people who experience homelessness. At Path Home, we serve families with children. I often refer to families as the invisible homeless population because it's important to recognize that while we have a crisis of people camping that we can visibly see all over town, there are just as many, if not more, people who we don't see downtown or camping in Delta Park or along the interstates. These are the invisible homeless, the families, seniors, veterans, survivors of domestic violence, people with disabilities who hide from plain sight out of fear for their safety. Families with children hide because they're afraid of something happening to their kids. They're afraid of someone from the state of Oregon, Child Protective Services taking them, or a kidnapper taking them, or someone hurting or abusing their kids. One of our community's biggest challenges is that we don't have great data about who experiences homelessness. We rely on a data source called the point in time count, which is conducted every odd numbered year. The most recent point in time count says that there's between 6,000 and 7,000 people who experience homelessness at any given time in Portland. The most recent count was the highest point in time count we've ever had since we started doing these counts in 2007. And the way you do a point in time count is it relies on a team of volunteers to go scour the city to find people that don't have homes and count them and get some information from them. And as you might imagine, that's a really hard thing to do. And we already know the point in time count is an undercount, especially for the families with children who are hiding from the very people like the outreach workers that are doing the homeless counts. We have a newer data source too. The county released this last year the new by name list, which reports that there's almost 15,000 people who are homeless. So that's twice as many people as the point in time count says. So that just highlights how far off the point in time count is. But I also believe that the by name list is a flawed data source that undercounts kids and families. The by name list says only 5% of these 15,000 people who are homeless are kids under 18. So 5% of 15,000 would be about 750 kids. But we have other data that really contradicts that. The Oregon Department of Education counts how many students experience homelessness each year. And last school year, over 4,000 students experienced homelessness in Multnomah County alone. And that does not count the little brothers and sisters who are not yet in school or all these kids' parents. At Path Home, over half the kids we serve are under 5, and they wouldn't even be included in that Oregon Department of Education number. So I would argue there's another 2 or 3 or 4,000 little kids, plus all the school kids, the 4,000 school kids, plus their parents. So we're talking about 10,000 or 11,000 kids and parents without housing. These families are living in their cars or deep in the woods or moving their tent around to new places every night. They might be doubled up and sleeping in a different friend or family's apartment every single night of the week, which is not a stable situation for kids who need a routine and deserve a place to do their homework, brush their teeth, and go to sleep. But this is the invisible population that doesn't show up in the point in time count or the by name list. So what happens is funding and policy decisions get made by the city and the county based on this severe undercount, ignoring the 10,000 kids and parents who don't show up in the count. So the city and the county end up focusing resources on the mostly individual, single people who do show up in the count. According to the 2024 State of Housing Report, Oregon has more homeless families with children than any other state in the country, at a rate 14 times higher than the national average. Among our nation's major metropolitan areas, Portland has the second highest rate of families experiencing homelessness in the country after only New York City. And the reason I believe that Oregon has so many homeless families is that we do not invest in providing services to families with children like we invest in other populations who experience homelessness, those populations that do show up in the point in time count and the by name list. Of the nearly $400 million a year that the city and the county invest into homeless services each year, less than 10% of it goes to homeless families with children. Yet I would argue that children are the most vulnerable population and that homeless families are a population that we could relatively quickly end homelessness for. The parents are very highly motivated to get out of homelessness and back into housing to provide a more stable life for their kids. And if we directed the right amount of resources to homeless families with children, we could end homelessness for all those families and knock Portland out of second place for having the most unsheltered homeless families. But it doesn't just stop with reducing homelessness now. The number one most predictive factor for whether you will experience homelessness in your life is if you have experienced it before. And I hate to say it this way, but the kids who don't have homes today will end up being the chronically homeless adults of the future. If we're ever going to get a handle on our homelessness crisis, we have got to start with the kids by making sure that they don't grow up in a cycle of generational homelessness. So who are these families that Path Home serves? I want to share a little bit about the demographics of the people that we work with. The majority of the families, 72%, are Black, Brown, Indigenous, or other people of color. Many of the families work while they're in shelter. They just work at low-paying jobs like Taco Bell or as hotel housekeepers. Right now, we have someone who works at the airport, and last year we had an administrative assistant from Adidas. The average age of someone in shelter is only 9 years old. And half the kids in shelter are under 5. Of our total client population, 56% of the clients are kids, and half those kids are under 5. About 60% of the parents are single moms, 5% are single dads, and the other 35% are two-parent families. Nearly half of the women that we serve have experienced domestic violence. A very, very small minority, less than 20% of families on any given year have substance abuse disorder. And by and large, these are good parents who have probably grown up in poverty and cycles of generational poverty themselves, and they do really want to make a good life for their kids. So let's talk about the causes of homelessness. The causes are varied and complex, but basically it boils down to housing is really expensive and jobs don't pay enough. The laws of economics tell us that when supply is low, right, because we tore down our infrastructure of housing. So when supply is low and demand is high, what happens to price? Price goes up. And that's exactly what's happening right now in Portland and across America. Housing is considered affordable if it costs no more than 30% of your income. The average two-bedroom apartment in Portland costs about $1,600 a month. So following the rule that housing can only cost 30% of your income, the average two-bedroom apartment would be affordable to people who made $57,000 a year, or about $27 an hour. But we know that full-time minimum wage earners bring home only $33,000 a year, $16 an hour. In order for a minimum wage earner to find an apartment that is affordable on that income, they would have to find a home that cost about $860 a month, which just isn't a reality in our community. Minimum wage earners have to work almost 90 hours a week in order to afford the average two-bedroom apartment that costs $1,600 a month. It's nearly impossible for single people to make ends meet on a minimum wage job. If one thing goes wrong, like car trouble or a big unexpected medical bill, people lose their housing. And when you add in the cost of childcare and the general expense of raising children, that adds extra stress to these already tight budgets. Minimum wage earners make about $2,000 a month take home. So let's subtract the cost of housing, $1,600 a month, plus the cost of childcare, which is about $1,000 a month per kid on average. And we're negative $600 before we've spent any money on food, utilities, transportation, school supplies. And you can see how impossible it is for families to make ends meet. So they end up losing their housing and they experience homelessness with their kids. So what about things like drug abuse, mental health, and poverty? Are these things also root causes of homelessness? There is a book out by a couple of researchers up in King County, which is Seattle, and they went around the country, they're statisticians, and they wanted to correlate rates of homelessness with some of these root cause issues to see if they actually are root causes. So they went to places to look at poverty. If poverty causes homelessness, then very high poverty communities should have a lot of homelessness. So they went to Detroit, the highest, most impoverished community in America. If poverty causes homelessness, then Detroit should have a lot of people without housing. But they don't. Detroit has almost no homelessness. So they looked at drug addiction. Does drug addiction cause homelessness? They went to West Virginia, the center of the opioid crisis, to see if drug addiction causes homelessness. There should be lots of people without housing. But again, there aren't. West Virginia has very, very low rates of homelessness. They looked at all of these different so-called root causes: mental illness, weather patterns, in migration, availability of services, all these things that people say, this is why these areas have a lot of people who are homeless, and none of them were correlated with actual rates of homelessness, except for two. One was rent price, and the other was vacancy rates. Where rent is expensive, that's where you have homelessness. Where vacancy rates are low, meaning there's not a lot of available housing, which probably also means the rents are more expensive, they're very closely tied together, that is where you have communities that have homelessness. None of the other root causes were actually causes of homelessness. Instead, things like mental illness, drug addiction, poverty, those are predictors about who in a community with expensive rents and low vacancies will actually experience homelessness. So they're predictors, but they're not actually causes of homelessness. So let's talk really quickly about the effects of homelessness. And so when you experience homelessness, as you might imagine, it's a very, very stressful experience. But brain science tells us exactly what's going on in the brain of someone who experiences homelessness. So when anybody's brain, all of our brains, anyone's brain experiences homelessness, our brains release chemicals that help us get through that um, experience. When anyone's brain experiences stress, when anyone's brain experiences any kind of stress, our brain releases these chemicals that help us get through that stress. If it's positive stress, eustress, things maybe like a big presentation at work or finals week at school or moving into a new home, our brains release chemicals that help us get through that stress in a positive way. They bring about focused attention, emotional balance, critical thinking, logic, rationality. Maybe you've had the experience of a time when you were super duper nervous about something and you had butterflies in your stomach. Those butterflies are the chemicals being released in your brain, traveling down your vagus nerve into your gut area, and that's where butterflies come from. So maybe you've had a time when you're very, very nervous about something, and then you get up there and you do a presentation or something and you just kind of nail it and you're like, wow, I was just awesome. Those are your brain chemicals responding to a eustress, a positive stress reaction. But then there is a negative stress reaction too. Distress, toxic stress, negative stress. This is the kind of stress that as we were evolving as humans, when our lives were in danger, our brains evolved to turn off our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brains that's responsible for logic, rationality, critical thinking, speech and language, being able to understand, comprehend any kind of communication. Our brains learned to turn off that prefrontal cortex through a chemical reaction, and that leaves us in our brainstem, our fight, flight, or freeze, our survival mode mechanism. And that was very helpful to us as if there was a wild animal running at us, trying to kill us. Our brains turned off, went into this survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze to save our lives. And this burst of these chemicals did that momentarily, saved our lives. But it turns out this same kind of chemical response is released in the brain when we experience things like abuse, neglect, hunger, domestic violence, and homelessness. Our brain responds in the same way as a wild animal running after us as it does when we experience homelessness. And when our brains experience this chemical response that turns off that prefrontal cortex, turns off our logic, critical thinking, rationality, when we have that prolonged experience for days, weeks, months, or years, our brains start to rewire themselves to always be in this survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze response. And when you're in survival mode, you don't have access to all the parts of our brain that help us interpret the world. So things are very confusing and scary. The way that you used to do things in the past doesn't work anymore, and you don't quite understand why. You can't, they say you can only understand every third word that's said to you. And it's a really scary and confusing place. You can't understand the rules of shelter or how to get and keep a job. These things are impossible because you are in this survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze response. And it's not like if you just tried really hard, you could bring your prefrontal cortex, your critical thinking, logical brain back online. It's a chemical reaction that prevents you from accessing that part of the brain. And this kind of prolonged stress response turns into what we call a trauma. This is what a trauma is. And traumas have really adverse health outcomes on children, especially. As kids are developing, if they're experiencing this prolonged distress response, they experience disrupted neurodevelopment. They have disrupted social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Those things lead to health risk behaviors, things like intravenous drug use, unprotected sex, criminal activity. Those things lead to disease and eventually disability. And ultimately, this kind of long-term toxic stress leads to early death. The average lifespan of someone who experiences homelessness is only 49 years old. So what do we do about this? How do we solve our homelessness crisis in Multnomah County? And I want to frame solutions to this problem in the context of Path Home's data-driven, proven model that works. And so, as I said before, our mission is to empower homeless families with children to get back into housing and stay there. We have been for 30 years supporting families, tracking our outcomes, and innovating new programs. We gather data about what works as well as what doesn't work, and we adjust our services based on what the families tell us they need the most. And so we today work with families in three main areas. The first area is prevention. If you were to ask me the real solution to ending homelessness, I would tell you it's preventing it before it ever even starts. Path Home prevents homelessness for families who are facing eviction, and we provide some financial assistance and case management to families to help them prevent all of that survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze response that we just talked about. It prevents it entirely. A lot of times the kids don't even know that they're about to lose their housing. And not only does homeless prevention prevent the crisis and trauma of homelessness, it's also the most cost-effective intervention that we can do. On average, it costs about $3,500 on average to prevent homelessness for families before it ever starts. And that's compared to about $19,000 to rehouse a family. So you can see once a family loses their housing, it costs about $15,000 to $19,000 to rehouse them, or $3,500 to prevent that housing loss in the first place. And it costs the average Portland shelter costs between $20,000 and $40,000 per person to operate. And so you can really see how much more cost-effective homeless prevention is. When families do lose their housing and we can't prevent homelessness, Path Home offers emergency shelter. We operate Family Village, which has space for 17 families at a time. Each of the families has their own individual private bedrooms that have doors that lock and real furniture. We end up serving about 75 to 85 kids and parents a night from the 17 families. Families have access to common spaces throughout Family Village, including a library and a computer lab. We have living room spaces for families with video games and TVs and movies. We have a little kids play area for the little kids where we have a trauma-informed play therapy curriculum called Play Space that help kids with all of their development and emotional, cognitive, and physical development skills. We have a central kitchen and dining room where we have meals, 3 meals a day, plus we have food available 24 hours a day for families. We have lots of outdoor spaces that families have access to, like a basketball court, a beautiful community garden that families work in together, and a playground for kids of all ages. And Family Village is the first shelter in Oregon that features trauma-informed design and architecture. And this is a kind of design that helps people heal through that crisis and trauma of homelessness, the trauma of being in survival mode, and leads to better outcomes. Things like shorter shelter stays and greater success moving into housing. At Family Village, 98% of families move from shelter to housing, with the average shelter stay being only 107 days. And we credit this success in shelter to implementing the evidence-based practice of trauma-informed design and offering culturally responsive trauma-informed services. That means that we understand what's going on in the brains of someone when they're experiencing homelessness, that they're in survival mode and they literally don't have access to their logical thinking brain. So we provide services that create a real deep sense of safety, and we also build dignity, restore power, and promote autonomy for families so that they can get out of survival mode and back in that critical thinking, logical part of their brain. The average Portland area shelter helps less than 50% of their people that it serves move from shelter to housing. Some shelters are as low as 15% of people move from shelter to housing. And we believe a piece of this is because shelters don't understand the trauma of homelessness. They don't understand what's happening in the brains of people who don't have housing. Many shelters set up complicated rules and structures that people who are in trauma cannot understand. So they get kicked out for violating the rules. Agencies create shelters that make people feel less than instead of making them feel calm, peaceful, and dignified. Shelter can be a very helpful part of someone's journey through homelessness, but shelters alone end homelessness for no one unless they're paired with housing placement resources to help people move through shelter and into housing. On average, families only stay about 3 to 4 months at Family Village before they move into their own home. And once housed, 93% of families keep their housing long-term. That's where another one of our evidence-based practices comes in, Housing First. This is Path Home's largest program, helping 98% of families from shelter move into housing, plus hundreds more families from a centralized county waitlist who we help move straight from homelessness to housing. Even for the hardest to house people with the highest levels of mental health and substance abuse disorder, the Housing First practice has worldwide data to show that it works. But it works if and only if it's implemented to fidelity. The Housing First model has 3 components. First, you minimize the amount of time that someone experiences homelessness and help them move quickly back into housing. Second, you provide a combination of short-term or long-term rent assistance based on the vulnerability level of the household and how much support they need. And third, and this is the most important piece, you have to provide long-term, relationships-based case management to people based on their needs. And this third component is an area that the city and the county do not fund. So most people, most providers are not providing this third piece, but it is the most critical component of the Housing First philosophy. When you do all 3 components, there is worldwide data to show that this model works, but people need support in order to be successful. It's housing first, it's not housing only. We need to fund long-term supportive services so that families and individuals can truly end homelessness for good. That might mean for some people, daily home visits. It might mean multiple times a day coming and making sure they're taking their meds, providing intensive clinical care. Other times it might mean a once a week visit or once every 2 weeks visit. It could look like individualized case management, skill training, access to food pantries, 12-step groups, mental health counselors, domestic violence advocates, and so much more. But these kinds of interventions need to happen once someone is already housed. Otherwise, their brain is still going to be in survival mode where they won't be able to comprehend reading, understand what people are saying, or make rational, logical choices. Path Home's data shows that this approach works. 93% of the families that we serve keep their housing long-term. And so what makes us so successful? How do we get these great outcomes? One piece is that we are one of the only organizations in Multnomah County that exclusively works with families. So we really know what the families need, and we are experts in serving families. If we invested the right level of resources into supporting homeless families in Multnomah County, we believe that we and our other system partners could end homelessness for families relatively quickly. Another unique piece of Path Home is that our business model mandates that at least 40% of our budget each year comes from private sources. Only 60% can come from government. And so the private resources are foundations and corporations and donors, individuals. And we structure our organization this way because government contracts can be really hard to administer. They don't pay for overhead support, and they don't pay for evidence-based practices to be implemented to fidelity. An example is our Housing First program. Our Multnomah County contracts don't pay for that third and most important aspect of Housing First, the long-term case management and support. Path Home has to raise private funds to pay for those services. If we didn't have those private resources, we wouldn't be able to offer that third piece. Many of our partner organizations are funded at 85 or even 95% by government contracts. They don't have the same flexibility in their resources to implement programs they believe in. They're only able to do what the government contracts pay for. One question I get sometimes is, if there is so much work going on, so much good work from so many great organizations in Multnomah County, why do we still have homelessness? And there's several of them. One of them is that we have an eviction crisis in our state right now, which is closely tied to how expensive housing is. And so when we have more evictions in Oregon right now than we've ever had in the history of our state. And our state legislature just cut 78% of our eviction prevention resources statewide. So we're going to see this eviction crisis only get worse. And there are more people falling into homelessness every day than we are able to move out of homelessness. And so there's just so much need and so much demand. There's a lot of domestic violence in our community that leads to homelessness. So many people become homeless because they are escaping abuse. One of our challenges of why we continue to have so much homelessness, even as there is so much good work going on, is affordable housing isn't actually affordable for people making low income. Most affordable housing is affordable to people who make 60% or 80% of the area's median income. That's still $50,000 to $70,000 a year. The families that Path Home serves don't make anything close to that. So they aren't even able to afford the affordable housing. And some affordable housing complexes that we do have are not healthy or safe places to be. They don't have the right level of on-site staffing and services. So there's often drug use and crime. Families are afraid to live in some of these places. So what do we need to do about that? Let's see here. So what do we need to do? One of our other community's big challenges is that we don't have an overarching plan to end homelessness. We need to create a theory of change or a plan or some overarching guidance so that we are all moving in the same direction. Because right now in Portland and Multnomah County, we've got our mayor focused on shelters. The county is focused on the Homeless Response Action Plan. We have the Metro SHS oversight committees, but all of these things are lists of expected outputs. They are numbers of shelter beds, number of meals served, number of hygiene stations. They're not outcomes that are actually making a difference in how many people are homeless in our community. So we need to create a plan and what outcomes we're going to be looking for. And once we do decide on those outcomes, we need to hold organizations accountable to meeting those outcomes. Each organization that contracts with the Homeless Services Department at Multnomah County has a list of outcomes that we agree to at the beginning of each year. But we have been told since the founding of the Homeless Services Department over 10 years ago, don't worry if you don't meet your outcomes, just do your best. There's no accountability for any of the organizations to meet the goals and outcomes in our contracts. So everyone continues to get the same level of funding the next year, but they're not actually meeting their goals. They're not actually reducing homelessness in our community. We also need to make affordable housing that's actually affordable. Our community needs housing that's affordable to people making 30% of area median income, which is closer to what minimum wage actually is. We also need to use our existing housing stock. While it is true that there isn't enough affordable housing in Multnomah County, there is plenty of market rate housing. We have about a 10% vacancy rate in market rate apartments right now. There are 6,000 available apartments in Portland, Oregon tonight. They're just not affordable to people who make no or low income. But even a market rate apartment costs, $3,200, $2,800 a month, $2,500 a month. That's still cheaper than what it costs to run shelter. The average Portland shelter costs over $4,000 per month per person. And what's cheaper than that is rent. We need to make sure that once we help people move into housing and help with their rent, we're also providing the right kind of services and the right kind of housing. What families need is not the same as what seniors need, is not the same as what people who are suffering from drug addiction or mental health need. We need to tailor our services and our housing options to people who experience different situations. I often get the question, does housing actually work for everyone? And the answer is yes. The Housing First model is shown to work even for the highest needs people with mental health disorders and substance abuse. But we need many different kinds of housing. Not the same kind of housing doesn't work for everybody. We need apartments, single room occupancy, transitional housing, group housing, shared housing, mobile housing, all kinds of different housing. We also need inpatient mental health facilities for people with severe and persistent mental illness. We used to have facilities like this, but the federal government closed them in the late 1970s in response to some pretty bad mistreatment of patients residing in those facilities. Think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the federal government directed communities to create coordinated care solutions for the people who were discharged from these inpatient facilities. But that never happened. We don't have anywhere for people with severe and persistent mental illness to go these days, even if they're a danger to themselves or others. The homeless services system is expected to house these people and support them, but we don't have medical training or doctors or clinicians on our teams. The shelters don't have the capacity to support these people, and they also disrupt shelter life so that other people also don't want to go to the shelter because they fear for their own safety. The mental health system is completely disconnected from the homeless services system, which are both disconnected from the addiction treatment system. That means that people are not able to get their needs met by any of the systems that are supposed to be there to help. There's a new executive order announced that aims to allow communities to use civil commitment to force people who have severe mental health or substance abuse into inpatient treatment centers. But the challenge is we don't have those inpatient treatment centers or substance abuse centers. It could be a very good thing for us to be able to use civil commitment, but we don't have places for people to go right now. So there's a big fear that the federal government wants to create concentration camp style places. And if that happens, it's going to make things way worse. If the federal government actually supported communities in creating safe, trauma-informed inpatient facilities, it could maybe be a very good thing for our community. But we're not sure that that's the direction the government's going to go. So what can you do to help the homelessness situation in our community? You can educate people that you know about what you've learned today. I'm happy to come do more presentations, have in-depth conversations and discussions, and help you all develop language that you can use to advocate. Because we need you to be advocating. We need you to interact with the city and county commissioners, tell them what's really going on, and then advocate for services that work and services that support homeless families. In closing, a few things, if there were a few things I really wanted you to take away today, it would be that homelessness is a housing problem. Drug addiction, mental health, and other factors are predictors about who will experience homelessness, but they're not root causes in and of themselves. Our community is only using a very limited data set to set our funding and policy decisions. We use the point in time count, or now the new Built for Zero by name list, but these tools do not capture the thousands of kids and parents who experience homelessness. We need to use other data, like the Oregon Department of Education data, to fully understand the scope of how many families don't have homes right now. And then we need to dedicate resources to the solutions that work. The housing first model works, but only if it's implemented to fidelity with all three of those components. And finally, we have got to prioritize families with kids in Multnomah County and the city of Portland. These kids are not choosing to be homeless, and neither are their parents. Many of these parents work while they're in shelter, and they just want to make a good life for their kids. So thank you all so much for your time today, for listening. And now we have a good chunk of time for some question and answers.
Thank you very much, Brandi, for that comprehensive presentation and all the good work that you do with Path Home. It's now time for our Q&A session. We'll take our first question on Zoom from Gail. Go ahead,
Hi. Good morning, Brandi. Thank you for your presentation. I've heard people argue just as passionately that treatment first should come and not housing first. And I'm just, and it's kind of like, so it sounds like sometimes I hear everyone has a homelessness solution and it's different from everyone else's, and they all argue just as passionately as you do. So I kind of like the idea of housing first, because I know to get organized in life, you need a place to be and have a safe, clean place to be. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. But I kind of wonder, you talk about the higher rents that we've had, and I'm a renter, so I know about that. What happens? These people get into your housing and all, how, and they're still earning these low wage jobs. How do you keep them affording the rent over long years and years? Because I don't think the landlords are going to lower their rent. How do you keep them affording the rent once they're in this housing you get them into?
Sure, great question. I'll say, treatment first versus housing first. My response is to always look at the data. The data about treatment first versus housing first is pretty clear. Housing first ends homelessness, spends less money, is more effective, and has better long-term outcomes. So that's what I look at, as I look at the data, not the passion behind the argument. In terms of how we support families long-term, is we will, I would say maybe about 35% of the families that we serve actually go into affordable housing. They have voucher or subsidized housing, and they are pretty good living with their low income. For every family that we work with that's capable of working, we help them try to get better paying jobs. And so we'll subsidize market rate rent for a year or 2 years while families are working in programs like Oregon Tradeswomen or the DPI group. They're learning how to be security guards, or they're learning how to be tradespeople, or they're learning how to be medical billing coders, or some sort of higher paying job. And so we support their rent as they're doing the skill development and job training and skill training, so that by the time our rent assistance ends, they are able to take over that higher rent. The other thing that we do is the second we move families into housing, we also help them get onto affordable housing wait lists. Sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4, some even 5 or 6 years of being on a wait list for affordable housing before you actually get into affordable housing. So we help families get on all the lists. We provide that subsidized market rate rent for them with our rent and client assistance while they're waiting on those wait lists. So it's kind of a combination of helping them find more affordable housing in the long term and or increase their income so they can afford housing as well.
Thank you.
Let's take our first question from the Friendly House. Question number 1.
Okay. I was wondering, you mentioned at the well, at some point in the thing about shared housing. An aside, I was able to, when I was younger, I didn't make a lot of money, and so was had a child and was able to have that child in a nice home, or pretty nice home, with shared with a friend, with a friend or another woman who had kids herself. Is there I mean, you mentioned shared housing. Is there a program to do something along those lines with the women? Because I see that it's so many of the people that are homeless, for the families. It's women with kids. It's the majority of that. And so, is there a way for 2 women to get together and have their kids together in a home?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is an organization called HomeShare that does exactly that. They match people, usually they are matching homeowners with people who are exiting homelessness, and the homeowners are, they often have a home that's bigger than what they need, and they've got 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 extra bedrooms. And so they are kind of matchmaking roommate situations so that exactly that people can share these homes and share in the costs and the utilities and all of those things. So it's an organization. They've been around for a few years now, 2 or 3 or 4 years, I think. And so, yes, that is one of the strategies that our community is pursuing. And I think it's a great idea and works really, really well. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I lived in a big house with a bunch of roommates, and so I think that's a big piece of our housing picture that we need to not forget about, for sure.
Thank you. Let's take our second question over Zoom, which comes from John Daggett.
Hi, thank you very much for this information. I have a comment and a question. I understand that in the country of New Zealand, they, regardless of what work you have, it's a livable wage that allows you to afford to live. You can have a home or some kind of thing. I don't know why we can't do that in this country. While we're increasing the quality of the job or the income that the job might give a person. But my question to me, so it's a fact we don't have an economy that supports people in a home. I think it's tragic. My question is, how in the world can a shelter be $4,000 a month? I mean, rarely. I mean, you get lots of people renting for less than that in homes with 3 and 4 bedrooms for $4,000 a month. What's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Shelter is the most expensive intervention in our homeless services sector. It's expensive because you have to have the ratio of staffing. For every 25 people that are in a shelter, you have to have 1 staff person on duty. So if you have 100 people in your shelter, that's 4 staff people on duty 24 hours a day. So at Path Home, we have 3 people on duty. We have about 75, 80 people in our shelter. So we have to have 3 staff people on duty 24 hours a day. So we have 3 a day shift, 3 swing shift, and 3 overnight. So 9 people every single day, plus all their benefits, plus all the food. Path Home spends like $100,000 a year in food for the families. It's all the utilities, pest control. I mean, they're just these huge, huge residential environments that are very, very expensive. And this is what I think a lot of people don't realize is shelter can be helpful. Shelter can be an incredible place for people to come in and take a breath and get a little bit of safety and security and community. But your brain is still in survival mode, even in shelter, especially a congregate shelter where you don't have any privacy. Think about like when you come home at night, imagine if there were 75 other people that sat in your living room and were looking at each other every single night of your life. Like you never get that. I know you never get that downtime of like, oh, it's just our family. And so there's just this constant stress, this distress reaction going on in the brain. And so they're not always healthy places to be. They're not always safe places to be. And you're in that survival mode. And they're also super expensive. And so we have created a system in Portland and Multnomah County that is over reliant on the most expensive intervention, shelter. Some communities across America that are making progress in reducing homelessness, they don't even do shelter at all. They have no shelters. They move people directly from camping, the street, wherever they are, right back into permanent housing, but they provide those intensive services. They're not just put in the housing and then like not talked to again for a month. It's daily interactions, visits, communication with the people that are moving into housing, and that is less expensive than the shelters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It looks like question number 2 out, so we'll move to question number 3 at Friendly House.
Where do LGBT teenagers fit in?
Yes. There are. That's one of the challenges in our community is that there are lots of LGBTQ teenagers who are kind of forced out of their home, and they end up being what's the jargony words for it are unaccompanied youth is what the kind of government description of them are. And there are so many of them. There are lots and lots and lots in Portland and Multnomah County in the metro area. There's also so many unaccompanied youth in many of the coastal towns up and down all of Oregon. And there's a lot of unaccompanied youth that have aged out of foster care and are now 18, 19, 20 years old and don't have anywhere to go and don't have any family to rely on. So this is definitely a huge issue in our community, the number of youth that are homeless. There is a homeless youth system in Multnomah County, the Homeless Services Department, that used to be called the Joint Office on Homeless Services. That's the same organization. Within the Homeless Services Department, there's 4 separate systems. There's the family system, there's the domestic violence system, there's the single adult system, and then there's the youth system. And the youth system is made up of New Avenues for Youth, Outside In, Janus Youth, and PAIR. Those are our community's 4 kind of main youth serving organizations, and they have all kinds of awesome programs. They have transitional housing, they have a few shelters, not many shelters, but they have some transitional housing program. They have group homes where it's like 6 or 8 youth living in a house, and there's like kind of an RA person there too. Age appropriate housing is really what I would call that. And so there's education programs. There's a high school equivalency program that New Avenues runs. There's all kinds of groups and art and education and recreation that goes on. Is it enough? No. Is there way more need in the homeless youth system than our community has? Absolutely. And they operate great programs too.
Thank you. Let's take question number 3 over Zoom, and that's Al. Go ahead, Al.
My family, my wife and I have both done a lot of work trying to help the homeless on the streets in the last, well, I stopped when COVID hit, but I was out on the sandwich patrol and I met a guy who talked to a guy, gave a guy a sandwich. He was right on this corner at 4th and Morrison, and he was divorced from his wife. That may be why he was homeless. They had a gorgeous young daughter about the age of 7. And on the days when he had custody of the kids, she would be sitting on the ground next to him. Now, I know from the history of 200 years of a dysfunctional system of this in London that a child is an asset if you're homeless and begging. I wonder if you know if this is going on, should this be treated as child abuse? And another thing that's kind of another thing that's not a criticism of your program at all is uh, my wife is aware of two of her friends who are out on the streets trying to do things for the homeless population, have had guns pointed at them in the last 2 weeks, with people holding the guns telling them, we don't want you in this neighborhood.
Mm.
Have you heard of any of those stories?
Yeah, well, certainly I see people with children, panhandling on the side of the road. It is not a technical definition of child abuse. And so that isn't something that would get someone's children removed. And experiencing homelessness is also not a reason for removal. There does have to be some sort of abuse or neglect going on as defined by the state of Oregon. And so I will not comment on the moral or ethical, my thoughts there. I think everyone can develop their own thoughts, and I think it is hard to see and hard to for kids to be in that environment. I haven't heard about anyone having guns pulled on them, but I'm very sorry, and that sounds really scary. And I think, one of the challenges in our community right now is that we have allowed this kind of public camping, public sleeping, and it's really gotten out of control. And I think people are upset and they're frustrated, and it's a real hard, traumatic, scary situation for so many people. And I can imagine how scary that would be for your wife's friends. I'm sorry that happened.
Let's take question number 4 at Friendly House.
Do I just start talking?
Yes.
So I'm kind of sort of opposed to affordable housing in the sense of like large apartment buildings that are restricted by income. And part of the reason for that is do you know the Louisa Flowers? You know that?
Oh, yeah.
So I live about 3 blocks from there. And it's like this large, like your stereotype of like a Soviet era apartment building. And so there are a fair number of shootings around that apartment building. I know 2 people who have lived in it. One of them is a woman, and she decided to move out because she felt unsafe. She's very low income, she's disabled, and yet she chose not to live in affordable housing because she felt it was unsafe. And, she has lots of stories about just like people passed out in like stairwells. And so sort of my feeling is that if you concentrate a demographic, you magnify the problems associated with that demographic. So problems kind of not as a stereotype or like a blanket statement, but in general, problems associated with kind of low income and people teetering on the edge of homelessness include more addiction, more prostitution, more sort of.
Can I press you for a question because we're getting pressed for time? So could you please move it to a question, please?
Well, now I forgot what I was saying. More income earned through crime, and so I wonder, if it's better just to have more housing and then use the money that you can spend on building affordable housing as housing vouchers, so that someone in a low income socioeconomic group would have as neighbors like college professors and business managers, and not just neighbor after neighbor of fellow addicts and so on.
Yeah. So there's a lot of data to show that kind of mixed housing that you're talking about really does get better outcomes. And so there's all kind of research that's been done when you have, one apartment building that has market rate and 80% housing and 60% housing and 30% housing in it. And all of those households are a community, and all of the kids are going to the same school and they're riding the same school bus and all of that. The data shows that the outcomes for everyone in the building rise. Even the highest income earners in those communities, the outcomes for their kids and the health outcomes and just the overall outcomes for everyone in those areas are better. And so there is a lot of reason, I think, why it's very positive to have that kind of mixed use housing development where it gets, and so that's what, I would always be a proponent for. Our family, the families that we work with at Path Home, they've had the same kind of experience. We don't go into the Louisa Flowers because that's for individuals, but in some of the family-sized low-income housing where it is concentrated poverty, and we are concentrating 150 households in one building where they are all at 30% area median income or less, there are very poor outcomes there at all levels. And so the challenges and the reason why, and so then before I go there, the other thing that has happened with places like the Louisa Flowers and a reason, so we're not following best practice by having mixed income, but then and we do have oh my gosh, my head is swirling with thoughts of how I want to respond. So we were not following best practice. Then when we're trying to develop affordable housing, that's like where some of the why we're getting these big concentrated buildings of poverty is it's very, very, very complicated to build housing. And if you have some units that have vouchers and some units that don't, and there's just all these different rules and regulations for different units in a building from an owner or landlord or property manager side of things, that makes it really hard. So they're like, oh, we'll just build we'll build a whole 100-unit building of 30% housing. You get a whole bunch of financial benefits for doing that. And so then you have this whole big, huge building of people living in poverty. When we first passed the Portland housing bond, which I think was in 2016, followed by the 2018 Metro housing bond. This is not the SHS supportive housing services. These are the bonds to develop affordable housing. 2016, 2018, that's when we started to see more and more investment in affordable housing in Multnomah County. But especially with those early complexes, those early units that were built, they didn't build in the supportive services into their budgets. And so they created places like the Louisa Flowers and the Vibrant and a whole bunch of these other big, huge low-income housing, affordable apartments with no services, no staff oversight, no case managers, none of that. Now it's required that you build that into your budgets, but 10 years ago, it wasn't. And so all of these places, they don't have the right level of staff support and supervision on site, allowing things like those bad behaviors you mentioned to proliferate, which is just not healthy for anybody.
Let's take question number 5 at Friendly House.
Sure. Thank you for taking your time this morning to do this. Appreciate it. And I was going to ask kind of the inverse. From listening to you speak, it sounds like I'm hearing that there are big macroeconomic problems. We've got a housing shortage and wages just aren't meeting what it needs to actually get into that housing at a reasonable level. And at the same time, I'm hearing there's a whole bunch of individual actors working in concert to solve this problem at the ground. I guess my question to you is, from your experience working in this space, who has the incentive to maintain our status quo as it currently is? Where is the pushback?
That's a great. I would say the shelter providers, our huge, gigantic network of shelter providers that are, there's like something like 3,000 shelter beds any given night in Multnomah County right now. And they're employing lots and lots of staff, and they have organizations that have been built up over the last 10 years or so to provide this shelter. So there's certainly an incentive there. I think the mayor and his plan to address homelessness by using shelter is another big piece of it, where I think that's where we're stuck a little bit. And I was just having this conversation the other day. There are all of the providers. So not every single, but almost every single homeless services provider, all of our executive directors meet every single Monday at 4 o'clock, and we have for 5.5 years. And so it's us and Central City and Cascadia and NEA, NARA, Latino Network, El Programa, SEI, Join, Our Just Future, Urban League. I mean, it's a lot of us. All the youth organizations, PAIR, Janus Youth, New Avenues for Youth, Outside In, Bradley Angle House, Raphael House. All of us meet, and we're all very, very, very aligned on what we believe the direction of our community should be. And we tell the elected officials, we tell the city and the county, here are the data-driven, evidence-based, proven models that have worked around the country and around the world. Please, let's do this. And they say no. And I get the question all the time, why? Why won't they do that? I also am very critical about we don't have a lot of outcomes that we're tracking in our community. We're tracking outputs, number of shelter beds, number of meals, number of hygiene station, number of pounds of trash picked up, number of camps swept, these numbers of things that aren't changing any. They're not reducing homelessness. They're just things that we can count. And I feel like there's a piece of it that is about power and reelection. And that if we want to get reelected and stay in power, then let's create these little lists of outputs that we can achieve. And then when I go back to get reelected, I can say, look, I achieved all of my outputs. Now reelect me. But our outputs aren't actually changing the needle on homelessness. And so I do feel like homelessness is a policy choice. We are choosing to spend 2/3 of our money on sheltering individuals, the most expensive, least effective intervention that ends homelessness for exactly 0 people, unless there is a pathway out into permanent housing. And so I can't really answer that in entirety, but those are some of my thoughts around why we're not using the evidence-based models that work.
Thank you. We're going to take our final 2 questions. Both of them come from Zoom. The first is from Janie. Go ahead.
You actually just touched on 2 of my questions that I had. First one being, is there a network in place where those of you who are working with the homeless can kind of talk and get together and discuss best practices? Other one was if there is a legislative type of organization that you can go to lobby for your needs. And then my last question that I have is just in regards to animal therapy with children. During COVID, I was teaching and saw the impact that their pets made for children during COVID. Just wondering if you provide animal therapy or allow pets as well. Thank you.
Great question. Really quick. Yes, we allow pets and we have all kinds of animal therapy. We bring the baby goats and the bunnies and the reptile man and the bird people and therapy dogs. And it's a huge piece. And families are allowed to have pets at our shelter. Not all shelters, but at our shelter, definitely. So yes, there are groups where we get together and we co-advocate together. And with the state of Oregon, legislatively, there's all kinds of different committees. There's not like one advocacy place that I could point to, but there's this group of all of us. We just call ourselves the Monday at 4 group. It's not very exciting, but the Monday at 4 group does a lot of shared advocacy at all levels: city, county, metro, state. In terms of other advocacy organizations that you all might be interested in, I would point you to Here Together. They're a great organization that is a broad community advocacy organization focused on homelessness and housing. They do a lot of work with Metro, with the city and the county, and then they also do lots and lots of education. So they would be a great option. It's really open to everybody. All of us, all the providers are members, but then there's probably like 100 or 150 other like community members, you all, that could join Here Together. And then the other one is the Welcome Home Coalition. And that's also a provider advocacy organization that really highlights the voices of our direct service staff. because the executive directors, we have all kinds of places that we can go advocate. And so Welcome Home is really lifting up those voices and the perspectives and advocacy of our shelter staff and our housing specialists, and really bringing those messages to our elected officials as well.
Thank you. Let's take our final question. It comes from Zoom and it's Hank Robb. Go ahead, Hank.
First of all, thank you for your work and thank you for the presentation. Second of all, please correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but it seemed to me that you reported that you do housing first and then make a lot of effort to have incomes go up. So presumably so that people can have more money to pay for housing. If that's correct, about what percentage of people who remain homed do it that way?
Yeah, it's the vast majority of people. And so, as I said, once we help families move into housing, 93% of them keep their housing long term. And the way we measure long term is we're working with the family. So we help them move into housing, and then we're going to provide however long of rent assistance and case management to them. On average, it's 12 to 18 months that we provide case management and rent assistance, but sometimes it's longer, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. It could be a long time depending on family situation. And so after all of that is done, after all the rent assistance is done, all the case management is done, that's when we consider that like a closed out household. Once they're closed out, we follow them every 6 months, 12, 18, and 24 months. They're no longer receiving any services from us, but we follow them for those 2 years to see if they're still housed. And at that point, that's the point where 93% are still housed. I would say the two main ways are we help them move into more affordable housing. So we get them on those wait lists so that they can move into a vouchered or subsidized unit that is affordable long-term, or they increase their income. And I would say the majority are increasing their income, maybe 65%. And then the other third or so are moving into truly affordable housing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great questions, you all.
All right, let's once again give Brandi a very big thank you for spending the time with us today.